Okay, so we're going to move into climatic factors, and this is a major pattern that everybody is involved in all the time. Humanity is always discussing this subject, the climate. It's one of the most common startup conversation subjects, the weather. And if we don't understand our climate and the landscape profiles that we're in, which are often shaped by climate, and we can't identify those very clearly and confidently, then our ability to design is greatly limited, and the chances of getting design right become more and more unlikely. Now, most people feel quite confident about climate. It's almost like a complacent subject, but people are always talking about the unpredictability of weather and the inability for climate professionals to predict the weather. But the title of this that I've put up there is the factors, the climatic factors. So I want to concentrate on the facts about climate. In other words, let's start talking about its dependable and predictable elements, because the life systems of Earth are very closely linked to the facts of climate. Now, although we feel that climate is not so predictable, from a land-based point of view, when you're working with natural systems, when you're gardening or farming and you're dealing with living elements that supply a lot of your needs or most of your needs, you do start to see a reasonable amount of regularity in the climate, and you do start to understand the patterned edge effects of climate. Yes, we have drier than usual periods, and we have wetter than usual periods, and we have colder and windier periods, but generally there is a reasonably dependable pattern. And you want to hope there is, because if it changes in a major way, we are in very big trouble. Because whole life systems fall over, because they have speciated to depend on that variation of climate within a certain range. Now, there are events that happen every 50 to 100 years, let's say, just to use those long timescale figures. But they're actually dips or highs in relation to a longer timescale. And if you've lived through enough of the major lows and highs, and you can reference farmers or people that have been on land for more than one or two or three 15-year cycles, you can usually get a pretty good reference point. If you can reference people who've been on land 50 years, that's pretty rare. That's pretty rare, actually. They can remember often the 50-year event of an extreme low or extreme high or an extreme flood, quite often, because it did actually affect them quite distinctly, and their memories locked it in because of the drama, because of the emotion of the event. But that's less and less available to us, because more and more of us are in in a support system which doesn't rely on the environment. We're in an air-conditioned situation, we're travelling in some sort of internal space transport, or we're going to a locked up situation where the weather's somewhere outside of the building, or it doesn't really affect what we're doing. We're in some kind of conditioned environment. We don't necessarily even touch the soil very often. But if you want to get back in touch with it, you do have to understand these cycles so you don't panic, at least, and you feel as if you've got a bit of an understanding of these lows and highs. So you do see quite a regular wave pattern. It is a pattern of sun cycle. And you will see from the driest year to the wettest year as two extremes, around 7.5 years. So if you're going to go from dry to dry on a sun cycle, or from wet to wet on a sun cycle, you'll see a 15-year crest or a 15-year low. You don't have that many 15 years in your adult working life. If you miss one here and there, you only got a couple, 45 years, maybe 60 years of working life. When you're actually, you're really responsible for what you're doing and what you're producing, what your interactions have in productive effect. So if you make a decision wrong here, like something does result in productive effect. And at one time, we would have had older people to reference who would have referenced older people as well, and we would have passed on that information, and we would have been more static as well. So if you are interested in longevity, you want to live a long time, if that's your interest, something comes up every time in longevity studies, and that is one of the elements that comes up all the time is people don't travel. People who live a long time stay in the same place. They don't travel very much at all. They definitely don't do international travel. They eat local food, very local food, that's very fresh or locally processed with natural nutrient-enhancing methods often. They're eating local food that's a minimum mileage, so it's 0 food miles, it's less than a mile away. 0 food time, and of course, it's also got 0 food guilt. They don't travel very much, they don't move around, they stay in one place, so their symbiosis with their environment builds an immunity resistance. And they're adapted to local insect bites and local biology in the soil, and the local soil, really, the local dirt. And they're usually also linked to something that connects them to the larger environment. So apart from being really local food, there's also something that travels outside or a long way in their bioregion that they consume, a product of an element that is from the larger area. It might be a migratory bird species that comes through, or it might be migratory fish. It might be, often is, honey, where the honeybees travel 3 kilometres radius away from a hive, so they harvest a very large amount of the environment. It's actually 6 kilometre diameter radius. That's much further than you can actually gather yourself. So there's usually some larger element that is also traditionally involved in those longevity diets. Apart from that, the only other thing that comes up is they usually breed with older men. So usually men that are over 50 father children, and not younger, because the men that I've made it, right? Once you get over 50, you're worth breeding with because you are a survivor, right? And you have a certain amount of longevity. You're not a sacrificial young male who's going to go out and like fight wars, sacrifice, hurt themselves, you know, over party, whatever. And that comes up quite often. Doesn't stop you having relationships, but it means literally parenting. So that's an interesting part of it. But the stability is also around the nutrient density and the diversity of the food and the ability to produce this very local, resilient diet is an understanding of climate, is understanding of exactly when you're likely to get the unlikely rain. When is the time of year that you need rain, and this is a little bit harder to predict. It usually comes, but when does it come? And can you be ready? And can you make that life element position at the right time just to get the backup of a weather condition? These are definitely patterns. And you've got reference if something unusual happens. Somebody's seen that 50-year frost, maybe that 100-year flood. They've seen it. They can give you a reference point. And also, there may be traditional songs that go back 1,000 years quite often. So there might be often is a traditional patterned memory that gives you reference. And there are extremes that are happening. We do appear to be experiencing a more erratic climate. And the extremes are a little bit closer than they used to be. So the cycles seem to be tightening up a bit on the extreme events. But the average event, the average factor of the climate, the standards that you can rely on, they're still there. If they weren't, we would have major environmental collapse because the species of our environments depend on this. Otherwise, they can't fit into those different changes. So the climate will level everything in the end. It is the extreme leveler. So you have to understand those, and then you've got a good idea of what you can achieve, and you can stretch it a little bit. Then you know what you're stretching. You can go a little bit, you can keep some diversity that requires a little bit drier condition, a little bit wetter condition, a little bit hotter condition, a little bit colder condition. That's what we specialize in, giving you that little bit of diversity stretch security. So that in the drier year, there are crops that pick up, and in the wetter year, you have crops that pick up, and in the hotter year, you have crops that pick up. The rest of the time, they're not very good. But on those extremity years, you've got the extremities sitting there. That's food security. That's not commercial. It's not a commercial crop. That's a survival crop right there. And that's apart from our perennial food that's not much recognized because it's not commercial. It's simply a convenience food because it's easy and perennial. So our climate, to bring it down to the very, very basics, you have the temperate climate. So this is cool to cold, and it's humid. This is North America. This is Canada. This is the southern end of South America. This is only a little bit in southern Australia, unless you go up high, which we'll talk about. Then you have the tropics. which are humid. And then on top of those, after that, you have the dry lands. And they are what they are, they're dry. And generally, and it is a bit of a generalization, they have high evaporation. And I'll put in here mostly, because it's not all dry lands have high evaporation. You do have cool to cold dry lands. In fact, Antarctica is the driest continent on Earth. It doesn't rain. And you won't think of that as dry lands in an evaporation sense. It's not an evaporative climate in Antarctica. It's just too cold to rain. So there are cool, dry lands, but generally it's a high evaporation. So over here in the temperate, let's just run through our temperate climate. We do have the really cold, so it's kind of separate to itself, but it's the polar climate, and it's at a very high latitude. So once you get past, 60 degrees north or south, you're getting into 66. You're not going to get a sunrise for a day of the year, and you're not going to get a sunset. The sun's going to go right around the sky one day, and it's not going to come up another day. So you get an extreme light effects now, and as you get up there, you start to get into another event, and not so many people up in those extremities. This really is the extremity of humanity. But then you get into the cold temperate, and this is also has big day length change, and very long days in summer, and very large annual vegetables, very large crops. This is where the record vegetables are grown here because of the big day length. But you can guarantee here that you get deep snows. In this climate that's cold temperate, you just have to ask this question: does it always snow? Yes, it always snows. And you get a reasonable cover of snow? Yes, we get a reasonable cover of snow. We're always going to get some snow. Okay, you're in the cold temperate. Then you go into the cool temperate. And it usually snows, but it doesn't hang around very long. Sometimes you might get deep snows on the colder years, but the average year, it's just, there's always a bit of snow cover, but nothing special. No big deep snows on a regular basis, and it's usually not a deep cover, and it doesn't last too long. Then you get the warm temperate. Here quite often it doesn't snow, but when it does, it's very light. It doesn't stay on the ground very long at all. Maybe a couple of days if you've really, really got a cold year, but it's an odd occasion to get snow, really. It can happen. This is the warm temperate zone. Then we go on one more climate, and it's a place name climate, and it is the Mediterranean. It means Middle Earth. And here it very rarely it snows. It might just have some snowflakes some years, but it's pretty rare. It's extremely rare. Unless we go high up in the air in the Mediterranean. That's another event We're just talking generally. And that's the last of these climates. And these are the climates that have, all of these have winter rain. And they have summer dry. That's a standard. You can rely on that. That's what's going to happen. And when you get to this hotter end, it potentially gets a little bit dangerous. Because this is where you start to get fire, quite serious fires at this lower end. Because the fuel load builds up over winter, and if you happen to have a really wet winter or a few really wet winters, and the fuel load builds, and then you get a really dry summer. And winds from the right direction are often coming from the inland version of the next climate. And that's a dry land effect. And you can have a very hot dry land wind blowing through a very dried off fuel load from winter. And there you go, you're in a serious situation.